Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Tim. What I'm going to say now probably belongs quite a lot later in the schedule, but like a classic NGO person, when an NGOs usually turn up late, speak too long, and then rush off to another meeting, looking at their watches. And I'm going to do two of those three things. With apologies, resource allocation is being discussed in my institution, and it's always good to be around when resources are being allocated.
Yeah, but you're coming back. But he's coming back.
Hopefully.
If you've not been allocated,
yes. If my strategy hasn't been messed up.
You might be allocated elsewhere.
So what I want to talk about in my 12 minutes here is how well integrated is UK food and agriculture policy across the domestic and the development agendas. And I sit on the Council of Sustain, and I also work for an international environment and development institution. So I do see quite often the dilemmas, the inconsistencies between domestic ambitions and this very strong development agenda of the UK government. I'm going to be talking about agriculture and the food chain and not other aspects such as diet and health, not because I'm not keen and interested, it's just not my area of expertise, and I'm sure that will come out later in the day. We do see that national policies are often not properly development tested before being rolled out. And there's another side to the same coin, that some things that have been well ingrained in development, such as fair trade, are not brought home to the UK in the way that they should be. And my main point that I want to address today is really that consistency and policy integration across the domestic and the development agendas must cut across a very broad swathe of policy, beyond DFID, beyond DEFRA, including another FSA, the Financial Services Authority, negotiating positions at WTO in climate change, G20, and oversight and regulation of private UK investors and retailers. It's a broad agenda, and it needs to all be reconciled to both the domestic and the development sectors. In the Food 2030 document that David mentioned, the statement says that our food security is ensured through strong UK agriculture and food sectors and international trade links with the EU and global partners which support developing economies. Now, that thing about supporting developing economies didn't have any indicators associated with it. DFID have put a lot of resources into supporting the agriculture sectors of developing countries. But what I want to do is to say, well, let's think about what supporting developing economies really means while having a strong and vibrant UK agri-food sector. And I want to spell out just a few principles of solidarity in food and agriculture policy that can bridge that. I think the first one is around first doing no harm in terms of double standards. And that means avoiding giving with one hand and undermining with another. It means ensuring that our UK food security and even UK energy security is not achieved at the expense of the rights of other countries to do the same. And it also means avoiding another round of top-down paternalistic interventions in the name of development, pumped up by one crisis narrative after another. It means supporting the resilience of majority agriculture, which is smallholder agriculture, and that means primarily domestic production, and it means a resilient natural resource base. It means protecting vulnerable sectors, especially because we have to have at least one more generation of youth involved in farming and agriculture before modernisation and urbanisation can provide employment. This generation thing is extremely important. Half a billion farmers in the world, 500 million farm workers in the world are going to be needing work and meaningful work. My third principle is about oversight and regulation of UK-based traders and investors. That means curbing the worst excesses of food price speculation, which fuels volatility, and volatility is much more serious for people on a low income, as you know, than most of us in the room. And it means doing the same for investors in farmland, investors in food production and retailing. It means investors in biofuels, in carbon markets, in land and farmland. It means properly opening up our markets to the developing world. And my last principle is that when you open up markets, you must address market power, because supporting fairness in trading between parties with very different market power is critical in terms of joined up policy. You could cut me off here, Tim, or I can give you a few examples.
Give a few examples.
Okay, I'll just pepper this quickly with a few examples.
Do we vote on him?
Not yet. Not yet. It just to show that when in reality, if you're looking at policy instruments, this is not an easy task. Let's take dairy. Many dairy sectors in the developing world are being seriously undermined by cheap milk powder imports from Europe. There's a very good ActionAid report around Bangladesh. 378,000 tonnes of milk powder exported from the EU to Bangladesh in 2010. And this shifts domestic dairy sectors away from a pull on the hinterland of domestic dairy producers supplying fresh milk from a whole milk sector built on powdered milk. That's happening all around the world. 50% of Cameroon's milk market is now based on imports. And that's an interesting thing. You could say, well, it's about export subsidies. Well, it's not really about export subsidies. It's about a dairy production system in Europe which is supported, but it's highly efficient. It has a market structure that allows these exports, even when European dairy farmers are struggling to make a living. And if you want coherent policy, you've got to support domestic production in a place like Bangladesh. When a country is growing and urbanizing, it can either pull on its domestic producers and have inclusive growth, or it can bypass the whole thing and live off imports. And so there are two prongs to that policy coherence. It's around having a look at the CAP, but also protecting vulnerable sectors like dairy, using special and differentiated treatment at the WTO, and slowly, not rapidly, liberalising these sectors. It's very important that these vulnerable sectors are protected, and I'm glad the Foresight report that David mentioned picked up on that. Another quick example, biofuels. 40% of US maize production diverted to ethanol in 2010. 3 billion euros of European money going into supporting biofuels. And these are first-generation biofuels that can be used in food as well as energy. I think a joined-up policy would, as Gordon Brown suggested, push for strong international action on first-generation biofuels rather than some mealy-mouthed or foot-dragging policy response to the renewable fuels goals. And how about curbing the worst excesses of food commodity speculation? Coming home from Brussels saying I've protected the city and the financial sector, when that was one of the only places where discussion around regulating the worst excesses of food commodity speculation would perhaps not be viewed as joined up or development-tested policy. Because high and volatile food prices do affect the poorest the worst. And lastly, as a piece of joined-up policy, how about the grocery supply code of practice, which David also mentioned? This code was first talked about in 1999. That's 12 years ago. The code was strengthened in 2010. The draft groceries bill was published in 2011. This will probably be introduced, the final bill, in the second session of Parliament. That may not be in law until 2013 or 2014. So 15 years of foot dragging just to get a simple code of practice on the links between suppliers and supermarkets with reasonable oversight and redress. 15 years while the power imbalances in the food chain have only built up. That's not proper joined up policy. So if I was to do my post-its to close, my one recommendation for policy for the for food supply chain and civil society, I would say to the state, look for coherence across a wider spectrum of policy instruments, especially in market governance, especially in speculation and investment, and with attention to not giving and facilitating development with one hand and taking or disrupting on the other. To the food supply chain, I think there are some good initiatives that commit some innovative companies to the UK development project, but don't expect the private sector to deliver more on poverty reduction than is realistic. The private sector will trade with the organised, with the capitalised, and with the accessible. It's not their job. They're not good at poverty reduction. And for civil society, my own mafia, I would say look to your own policies and positions. Don't just look to others, but look to your own positions. For instance, on localisation, I am a strong supporter of local food, but some of the terms associated with it, such as a neo-colonial food system or that countries should feed themselves, are both patronising and ill-informed. Thank you very much.